Think about the people you know who wear a Rolex, right? It might be a hotshot lawyer, your boss, or maybe even your boss's boss. For decades now, this brand has basically been a magnet for folks with a lot of money or, frankly, a deep need for social validation. But if that's all you think a Rolex is, you are entirely missing the point. Behind that little ticking device on your wrist is over a century of absolutely incredible history, uncompromising engineering, and really exquisite art. So in this explainer, we're going to look way past that flashy modern reputation and uncover where these $50,000 watches actually come from.
When we think about these legacy luxury brands, we usually imagine, generational wealth, Swiss aristocracy, centuries of inherited privilege. But the sheer improbability of the Rolex empire is just staggering. What if I told you the absolute pinnacle of capitalist status was actually the brainchild of a 12-year-old German orphan named Hans Wilsdorf? He didn't start with an empire, he started with literally nothing. So let's trace exactly how this young man built the most recognizable watch brand on Earth.
Let's start with Section 1, the unlikely watch pioneer. So, at just 12 years old, having tragically lost both of his parents, Hans's aunt and uncle sent him off to a boarding school in Coburg. Now, this could have been a pretty sad end to his story, but instead, it was the exact catalyst he needed. At this school, Hans learned to speak English remarkably well. And because of that specific skill, after graduation, he actually scored a job as a translator at a Swiss firm named Kuno Korten. And they just happened to be one of the biggest watch exporters in Switzerland at the time. Suddenly, you have this young orphan rubbing elbows with the absolute elite of watchmaking. One really key connection he made was with Hermann Agler, a guy who had just inherited a massive factory producing unassembled watch components. Armed with these high-level connections, Hans took a huge leap. In 1905, he moved to England and launched his own company, funded by a loan from his brother-in-law Davis. And they called it Wilsdorf and Davis.
But, starting a company is one thing. Deciding what you're actually going to sell is a whole different beast. And this perfectly highlights the immense risk Hans took right out of the gate. At the time, if you were an upper-class man, you wore a pocket watch. That was the standard. They were durable, passed down through generations, and viewed as highly masculine. Wristwatches, on the other hand, well, they were considered flimsy, wildly inaccurate, and almost exclusively worn by women. But Hans, he saw the future. He made a massive bet on wristwatches. He contracted his buddy Hermann Agler's factory to produce these really high-quality Swiss mechanisms, imported them to England, and sold them to local retailers. And because those internals were so well made, Wilsdorf and Davis found success pretty early on.
Now, the crucial thing to understand here is that Hans wasn't just a good importer. The guy was a marketing visionary. Back in those days, standard practice was just to slap the local retailer's name on the watch dial. But Hans wanted people to associate this incredible quality directly with his own company, not some middleman. So, in 1908, he decided to register his own brand name. He wanted something short, punchy, and just super easy to remember no matter what language you spoke. That name was Rolex. He started printing it squarely on the dials of all his watches, taking complete ownership of the product's reputation.
Of course, to convince a skeptical public that a little wristwatch could be just as reliable as a hefty pocket watch, he needed hard proof, and he went out and got it. In 1910, Rolex secured the Swiss Certificate of Chronometric Precision. Then, by 1914, a Rolex became the very first wristwatch in history to receive a Class A precision rating from the highly prestigious Kew Observatory over in London. But the true catalyst, the thing that firmly cemented wristwatches in the mainstream, was actually World War I. Just imagine trying to dig out and check a pocket watch while holding a rifle in a muddy trench. It was incredibly inconvenient. Soldiers needed a reliable way to check the time hands-free, and so Rolex wristwatches became a massive favorite out in the field. The absolutely brutal conditions of the war ended up proving the unmatched quality and durability of the brand.
But, as we know, success always brings new problems. Right after the brand gained all this incredible momentum, they hit a massive roadblock. The British government imposed a staggering 33% wartime import duty on all luxury goods, which included watches. This tax hit Hans's business so incredibly hard that it essentially wiped out his profit margins in England. He quickly realized he just couldn't afford to operate out of London anymore. So, in 1919, he packed up, moved the entire operation to Geneva, Switzerland, and incorporated under a new name, Mons Rolex.
Which brings us to Section 2, Conquering Land and Sea.
Now, operating directly out of the watchmaking capital in Switzerland, the focal point for the company became relentless evolution. They'd already popularized the wristwatch itself. The next huge hurdle was actually making it waterproof. Now, custom-built waterproof watches did exist as far back as 1851, but they were never commercially successful. The engineering bottleneck always came down to the crown. You know, that little pin on the side you use to wind it up and set the time? It was a glaring weak point where water would just seep in. But Agler's engineers finally cracked it.
By making the case hermetically sealed and designing a highly secure crown, Rolex released the Oyster model in 1926. It was literally the world's first commercially successful waterproof watch. And to make it even more secure, in 1931 they invented the self-winding mechanism. This meant you no longer had to manually unscrew and wind that crown every single day, which kept that airtight seal perfectly intact.
But look, having a great product means absolutely nothing if nobody knows about it, right? And Hans Wilsdorf was an absolute master of PR. In 1927, a young woman named Mercedes Glitze became the first woman to swim across the English Channel. But almost immediately, critics started doubting she actually did it. To silence them once and for all, she agreed to do the grueling swim all over again. Hans saw a golden opportunity here. He handed her a Rolex Oyster to wear during this vindication swim. She was in the freezing water for hours, making it barely 7 miles from the shore before the Coast Guard had to pull her out. But through all of that, she was wearing the Oyster and it had perfectly tracked her time down to the minute. This was essentially the birth of celebrity testimony for watches, and Rolex rode that incredible marketing victory well into the 1950s.
And they didn't just stop at the English Channel. Rolex started strapping their watches to basically every major human achievement they could find. In 1933, when Lord Clydesdale became the first man to fly over Mount Everest, he had a Rolex on. In 1935, when Malcolm Campbell absolutely shattered the land speed record by hitting 300 miles per hour, yep, he was wearing a Rolex. And in 1960, when the manned vessel Trieste descended into the crushing, terrifying depths of the Mariana Trench, there was a Rolex attached right to the outside of the hull. Stacking these extremes back to back created this untouchable aura around the brand. Wilsdorf proved over and over again that a Rolex could survive anywhere a human could, and even places they couldn't.
Now, because the brand had achieved this legendary elite status, Hans realized he was actually missing out on a much broader market. But there was no way he was going to lower the price or the quality of a Rolex to reach them. So instead, in 1946, he created an entirely new brand, Tudor. Tudor watches offered nearly the exact same mechanical reliability as a Rolex, but they were positioned and priced for the upper middle class. It was a brilliant strategic move to capture way more of the market without ever diluting the core prestige of the primary brand.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Surviving the Quartz Crisis.
In 1960, the era of Hans Wilsdorf came to an end when he passed away. But his death coincided with what would quickly become the absolute darkest hour for the entire Swiss watchmaking industry. Between the late 1960s and 1983, a devastating 2 out of every 3 Swiss watchmakers went completely bankrupt. Why? It was the quartz revolution. A massive flood of incredibly cheap, battery-powered quartz watches from Japan and the US just overwhelmed the global marketplace.
The harsh reality was that mechanical watches simply couldn't compete on utility anymore. Quartz watches were dirt cheap, lightweight, and frankly far more accurate at telling time than a bunch of complex mechanical gears. So how on earth did Rolex survive when so many heritage brands perished? Well, they realized they were no longer in the business of just telling time. They pivoted completely. Rolex stopped trying to compete on accuracy and price and leaned entirely into their heritage. A mechanical Rolex wasn't just a watch anymore. It was positioned as hand-assembled, collectible art that literally takes over a year to make. They survived the quartz crisis by turning their sheer inefficiency into their greatest selling point.
Which brings us to our fourth and final section, a billion-dollar charitable legacy.
Today, Rolex is undeniably the biggest watch producer in Switzerland. But what you really have to understand here is just how rare these pieces actually are in the grand scheme of things. Rolex accounts for barely 1% of global watch sales volume. They absolutely refuse to outsource any of their production. Every single piece is meticulously crafted in-house, prioritizing absolute quality over mass-market quantity.
But contrast that tiny 1% volume with this crazy reality. In terms of global market value, that 1% slice commands a staggering 25% of the total industry's wealth. Because they resolutely refused to compromise during the quartz crisis, the immense painstaking effort put into creating and assembling these watches gives them a collectible value that no mass-produced piece of technology is ever going to achieve.
And they maintain this aura of total exclusivity and elite performance today by aligning themselves with the absolute pinnacle of global sports. Right now, they serve as the official timekeeper for 2 of the 4 tennis Grand Slams, 2 of the 4 major golf championships, the entire Formula One championship, and the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans endurance race. They are just deeply, inextricably embedded in the culture of victory and high-class achievement. But this is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. You see this brand acting as the ultimate status symbol for powerful executives and celebrities all over the world. But ever since Hans Wilsdorf's death in 1960, the ownership of the Rolex company was transferred entirely to the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. This means the company that produces arguably the ultimate symbol of capitalist wealth is, to this very day, completely owned by a foundation that uses its income for charity.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. We started out by talking about the modern cliché of the Rolex wearer, right? The person seeking social validation through a $50,000 piece of jewelry. But when you really understand the history, the 12-year-old orphan who built an empire from scratch, the muddy trenches of World War I, the freezing depths of the Mariana Trench, and the fact that all of this wealth ultimately funds a charitable foundation, it completely flips the script. If the world's most recognizable luxury brand is actually funding a charity, what does that really say about why we buy luxury in the first place?